People are always talking about how time flies, and then you understand how true that is when you've got a moment to pause and take a look around and assess. Well, here we are at episode 90 of The Far Middle, another mini milestone episode. And don't look now, but we're approaching the 100 mark. And as has been the case since episode number 1, I am your host, Nick DeOlius. We've got a lot to talk about in episode 90, so let's get right to it. Some of you constant listeners recall that a few weeks ago we dedicated an episode to a stork, the mad stork to be specific, who of course was Ted Hendricks. Well, episode 90, we're going to dedicate it to another animal, which is going to be a shark and his team, as in Tark the Shark, because we're dedicating episode 90 to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, or UNLV, and the Runnin Rebels of the 1989-1990 NCAA season, who became national champions. Their coach was Jerry Tarkanian, or Tark the Shark. I loved UNLV of that era, and I also loved Tarkanian. I think both were very innovative and extremely disruptive. Let me tell you and give you the reasons why. The first reason might be something that even college basketball fans are unaware of. So this is yet another example, constant listeners, of the value add of the far middle. The first reason actually traces back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The assistant coach at UNLV under Tarkanian was a man by the name of Tim Gergerich. He was born in Pittsburgh, attended Central Catholic High School here, and then he ended up going to and then ultimately coaching the men's basketball team at Pitt for a number of years in the 1970s. Gergerich landed at UNLV under Tarkanian, and he brought with him a very innovative and disruptive defensive scheme that he dubbed the Amoeba defense. And the Amoeba defense was extremely effective on the hardwood in the late 80s and early 90s to the point where it helped bring UNLV the national championship in 1990. This is what is great about sports, at least in my opinion. You've got a little-known assistant coach who develops a new scheme, turns a sport on its head until there's an answer that evolves in response to it. You disrupt the status quo, and then there's another disruption that will sort of reverse that or overcome it, leading to the next thing. Now, the second reason I love the 1990 Runnin Rebels was the players on the team, unbelievably talented to the point where it looked and felt more like an NBA team than a college team. Larry Johnson, of course, was a superstar from that team. Stacey Augmon wasn't too far behind. Greg Anthony was spectacular. All three of those players were drafted in the first round of the NBA draft in 1991. And the Runnin Rebels also had a second-round draft pick in 1991 and in the NBA draft, that being George Ackles. The 1990 Runnin Rebels, they were super talented and super intimidating, and they were a lot of fun to watch. But the biggest reason as to why we're dedicating episode 90 to the 1990 Runnin Rebels, it speaks to the coach, Tark the Shark. He represented an immigrant story. His mother escaped Armenian genocide. His grandfather and uncle were beheaded during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He ground his way through the classic coaching progression, ultimately landing in Las Vegas. He was entertaining on and off the court. I love listening to his press conferences. And, how many coaches can you say that about these days? Hello, Bill Belichick. And everyone got a kick out of seeing him biting that white towel while coaching from the bench during games. But there was a lot more to Tarkanian than just a great backstory and entertaining personality and winning at the highest levels. He loved to thumb his nose at authority. He battled the NCAA for years. The NCAA would sanction him or investigate him, and then he would publicly criticize them for not investigating more traditional, larger programs and instead picking on smaller schools without the means and influence to defend themselves. He sued the NCAA all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States when the NCAA suspended him for 2 years. He lost his case at the Supreme Court, but ultimately he prevailed when it came to light that the NCAA investigations were relying heavily on hearsay and were often stacked against whoever the NCAA was going after at the time. Look, I understand Tarkanian was no angel. He only looked like one when he smiled with those sad eyes, and I'm sure UNLV wasn't a perfectly run, totally clean program. But that coach and that program, they were clearly disruptors. They had chips on their shoulders, and they weren't afraid to speak truth to power. You couple those things with winning at the highest level. In fact, they're the last team to win the NCAA men's tournament that's not from a major conference. And you've got a fitting dedication for Far Middle episode 90, the 1989-1990 UNLV Runnin Rebels, coached by Jerry Tarkanian, national champs. So let's start connecting dots, shall we? We just talked about how innovation and disruption can make great things out of where nothing existed prior. And who knew of UNLV basketball before Tarkanian? In Las Vegas itself, which today is viewed as a miracle city in the middle of a giant desert, it wouldn't even exist if it weren't for modern marvels developed in energy and construction and capitalism. Well, there is an opposite dynamic that unfortunately can come into play. And that is where government will work to impede progress and impede innovation and impede disruption. And in place of those, government's going to look to force a favored path or technology or decision, often with perplexing and very troubling consequences. We saw an example of that at the end of last year from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Just before she stepped down as Speaker, she gave a speech to support the Uyghur Policy Act. Now, the legislation she was speaking of was designed to help counter the genocide of the Uyghur people in China. So Speaker Pelosi's speech was actually quite good, and it hit all the right points. She had a section of that speech where she referenced Congress's unbreakable commitment to shining a bright light on the persecution of the Uyghurs. Now, despite saying all the right things, Speaker Pelosi's speech shared little in common with what Speaker Pelosi's policies and track record had been via Congress's acts over the past number of years in the arena of energy policy. Congress, under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, was taking actions in the opposite direction of Speaker Pelosi's words in her speech defending the Uyghurs and the Uyghur Policy Act. Everyone, including Congress and Speaker Pelosi, knows that the supply chains for wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicle batteries, they're controlled by China, and the key links in that supply chain rely heavily on slave labor within China, often using the Uyghur people as slave labor. So Congress and Speaker Pelosi are not unbreakable in their commitment, as she put it, to stopping the persecution of the Uyghurs. To the contrary, Congress has acted via policies that have worsened the condition and oppression of the Uyghurs. On top of that, these energy and climate policies manage to simultaneously penalize the American domestic energy worker in industries like natural gas and oil and pipelines. So can you think of a more damaging set of policy prescriptions? On one hand, you're surrendering energy security via domestic energies, along with the family-sustaining wages paid by careers in those industries. And at the same time, on the other hand, you're dealing our adversary, China, geopolitical leverage by handing them our energy security so they can build their economic might on the backs of slave laborers in places like Xinjiang. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more egregious set of policies that work against our national interests and that feed oppression on the other side of the world than these energy and climate policies championed by Congress and its leaders like Speaker Pelosi. Do we really believe that any of these policy prescriptions are actually going to save the planet or improve the overall environmental quality and health of its inhabitants? The more you think it through, the more that comes to light, the more blatantly obvious it is that these energy and climate policies are going to worsen the environmental health of the planet. They're going to strengthen the hand of the oppressor, and they're going to weaken Western Republican democracies, and they will crush the freedom of the individual. The words from Speaker Pelosi were great, but talk is cheap. Her actions through these policies were horrible, but actions, they always speak louder than words. This speech from Speaker Pelosi, in the context of the Uyghurs, it brings us to our next connection of a dot to link to. We're going to go back in time. Let's go back to the early 1940s, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor. America was still largely in isolationist mode. Hitler was running rampant across Europe. Churchill and the UK were standing alone. And our president at the time, of course, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, FDR was of the mindset that Germany was not just a problem, but was employing an economic model that was designed to dominate the rest of the world. FDR gave a speech in the spring of 1941 that spoke to the global ambitions of Nazi Germany. Roosevelt warned us that Germany ultimately desired to set the terms for a new economic order across the globe, and that American workers would ultimately pay the steepest of prices if Germany were to be successful in their economic endeavors. Now just listen to what FDR said in the middle of 1941. Quote, "The American laborer would have to compete with slave labor in the rest of the world. Those in the New World who were seeking profits would be urging that all the dictatorship desired was peace. Freedom to trade is essential to our economic life. It would not be an American wall to keep Nazi goods out. It would be a Nazi wall to keep us in." End quote. Wow. You trade out a few of those keywords, so notably, let's replace Germany with China and put that 1941 speech in the context of 2023. It's like a voice from the past is warning us about the dangers of the present. It's not history rhyming, as Mark Twain would have quipped. It's outright history repeating. Today, the American worker is competing with the slave labor in China. It's domestic natural gas going up against blood solar. And when we trade energy independence for an energy dependency on an adversary like China, which these climate and energy policies inevitably lead to, it's going to lead to not a Nazi wall, but a Chinese Communist Party wall. And that is going to keep us economically penned in. And what's crazy about this current competition is that our own government is setting policies and passing laws that's subsidizing the slave labor in China, and it's penalizing the domestic American worker earning family-sustaining wages. Absolute insanity via policy of the elite and expert classes. And why are we doing these things? Of course, to tackle climate change and because of Code Red for Humanity. At least so those experts and elites tell us. It makes you wonder what's really at play here when it comes to the current state of energy and climate policies. And look, many of you constant listeners know that I am not the biggest fan of FDR. He had some serious flaws and brought us bigger government that has grown out of control since then. But he could inspire, and he had a definite way with words. In this speech from May of 1941, it's just another example of what he could do. So let's heed the advice from a great American from over 80 years ago, and let's break the repeating of history. By the way, if you're interested in delving a little deeper into the reasons that I felt FDR was an overrated president, give a read to my book, Precipice, The Left's Campaign to Destroy America. I go into a bit of a historical lineage of how the growth of big government progressed over the past 100-plus years, going back to Woodrow Wilson and through to FDR and the New Deal, into LBJ and the Great Society, and concluding with Presidents Obama and Biden. Tell me what you think. Let's pull on this connection that we just touched upon, which is used in the cover of Tackling Climate Change and Code Red for Humanity and this pending doom that is rapidly approaching or upon us, to justify instituting policies and laws and mandates and subsidies and prescriptions and beliefs that lead to very damaging and illogical consequences. How is this happening, and why is this happening? While some of those root causes are varied and they can be quite complex, we did talk about many of those over the prior 89 episodes of The Far Middle, but some of the root causes are frighteningly simple. And one of those simple and frightening root causes is what I'd like to discuss at this point. CNN conducted a poll around the midterm elections in 2022, last year, and I found the results for a key demographic, which were young voters, to be really interesting. 70% of young voters had the view that President Biden hasn't done enough or paid enough attention to the country's most important problems. Now, that conclusion in and of itself wasn't shocking to me. Young voters, along with many other voters, they probably feel that way and have felt that way whether the president was Biden or Trump or Obama or Bush or going back to FDR. Nothing new or surprising there. But what did surprise me was digging a little deeper into what types of topics young voters felt that President Biden wasn't paying enough attention to, or what types of topics represented problems for the nation. And near the top of that list was climate change. Just to put this in perspective, almost half of young Republicans, these are Republicans, believe that this nation needs more and not less action to tackle climate change. And I'm sure it's close to 100% for young Democrat voters. Now, the next generation has been indoctrinated through years of education in media and culture to believe that climate change is the world's and this nation's most vexing crisis or problem. And that is a serious problem in and of itself, because climate change and our abilities to do anything about it should rank much lower in the wall of worry when it comes to what ails this nation and world. And worse yet, a lot of the proffered solutions to tackling climate change are not only failing to address it, but they are feeding into and making worse issues, topics, and entities that are much larger threats to us, such as an aggressive Chinese Communist Party or a Russian leader named Putin. It's sickly ironic. I believe the CNN polling. I think it's accurate. And the same entity that conducts the polling is also an entity that conducted the indoctrination that led to the polling results. Very interesting. And these prior topics that we just discussed, they connect to another dot that I'd like to discuss. Specifically, talking about what government is prescribing or prohibiting versus what Americans, whether they be young adults or older, worry about when it comes to climate change. My friends at Valadeer developed a position paper or an insight regarding what a pair of Appalachian pipelines, if built, would do when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. So look this study up online if you're interested, and I would encourage you to do so. It's a good read. The title of the Valadeer Insight study is A Pipe Dream? But running the math shows that two Appalachian pipelines, one being Atlantic Coast and the other one being Mountain Valley, would have reduced carbon dioxide emissions by over 400 million tons. That is a massive reduction in global CO2, brought about, not surprisingly, by the pipelines feeding the ability to send Appalachian natural gas to demand centers nationally and globally, where they will be able to be utilized to displace coal on the power generation grid. That has a massive CO2 benefit because natural gas is an inherently reliable and clean-burning fuel. Now that's the math in the carbon accounting. Additional benefits of these two pipelines would be private investment in Appalachia and the Southeast United States and the Mid-Atlantic United States to drive capital investment, improve infrastructure, increase energy security, grow family-sustaining jobs, and increase tax revenue base. So obviously it's not just a carbon dioxide reduction benefit that would be a massive advantage to these two pipeline projects. There are numerous other benefits. But what has government done when it comes to these two pipelines? Well, the regulatory and administrative state of the federal government, through various entities, including the EPA and FERC and so on, they've done everything they could do to hold up or outright kill these projects. Why? Because the government says that these pipeline projects are going to hurt our ability to tackle climate change. The administrative state is taking its cue from its brother in arms, the environmental movement. But I just told you the math as to what these two projects would do when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions, which drive climate change, over a 400 million ton reduction in CO2 emissions. You see, the government and the environmental movement, they're using the cover and the boogeyman of climate change, while at the same time they're avoiding any of the logic and any of the legitimate math that's tied to climate change. Tell the fairy tale, avoid the reality. And when you're talking and telling the fairy tale, make sure you're doing so in elementary schools, in high schools, in colleges, on cable TV, on the internet, and on social media, to the point, to the level when anyone who's not familiar with the energy industry, when they're looking to develop a view, the constant and continual propaganda is going to lead them to think these pipelines are bad things for the environment. And that, constant listeners, that's how you end up with our government under the direction of the environmental movement, how it ends up killing two massively beneficial private sector energy infrastructure projects that would grow our regional economies and lower global carbon dioxide emissions. One has been outright canceled, which was Atlantic Coast by its sponsor, utility, and the other one has been delayed for years, which is Mountain Valley. That's our government, the environmental movement, the elite class, and the expert class, all in a nutshell. But those entities I just named, they don't just stop progress. At the same time, they work incessantly to keep funding and throwing resources at obsolete or inefficient industries and endeavors. An example is what I'd like to discuss next, and it brings us to our next connection to make, and that is in the arena of public transportation. So while the elite and the expert class, they work to kill private sector natural gas pipeline projects that would bring great benefits to our future, the same special interests, they work to constantly ensure that billions, or increasingly trillions, of taxpayer dollars are funneled to favored activities and industries that don't seem to have a future return on investment thesis. It's sort of government funding yesterday's demands or answers and not realizing that today they're no longer in vogue or relevant. I want to read you some statistics that put this issue in stark perspective. For the first 3 quarters of 2022, Americans took 4.6 billion rides on all types of public transportation. Now, I accept 4.6 billion of anything is a lot, but let's put that in perspective, both in magnitude and directionally, to where American ridership on public transportation was at before pandemic. That 4.6 billion ride statistic, it's 62% lower than the year before COVID-19 hit. And these are federal data, by the way, collected by the American Public Transportation Association. The bottom line here is pretty clear. Americans' desire to utilize public transportation, it's dropping off of a cliff, and it's facing existential threats. Keep in mind, the 4.6 billion rides would have been much lower but for the enormous subsidy the government throws at public transportation and many of its riders. We talked about how fares are either not charged in many cities or are not even enforced for those who are skipping paying the fares. To count them as riders, that's more than a bit misleading if you're looking to assess demand for public transportation where the rider is abiding by the rules and paying a fare. I think the typical American got it right when it comes to public transportation. It's no longer desirable, like it might have been in the past. It's slow, it's unreliable, and it's increasingly dangerous. It's not a good consumer experience compared to driving an automobile or utilizing something like ride-hailing. And with the vaunted hybrid work environment and remote work, the need for public transportation is probably at its lowest levels that we've ever seen. What has our leadership done? Whether it be the president on down through mayors of big cities, the answer, of course, is that they're spending more money than ever when it comes to public transportation subsidy. And let me remind you that the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that we saw in 2022 is a great example of how taxpayer dollars are being appropriated into public transportation and the special interests that are feeding off of it. So there you go. Demand for a service is way down, and it looks to be getting worse. The costs of the service are going up. The quality of the service is degrading by the day. New technologies have disrupted the space and offer a more efficient and cheaper and more enjoyable experience. And what does government do? It throws even more taxpayer dollars at the soon-to-be obsolete endeavor, to the tune of over $1 trillion. Think about what might have been done with that level of resource across this nation, considering all the uses that we could put it toward. What a shame and what a waste. How all of this culminates and plays out on the global scale, it gets quite interesting, and I also find it to be quite chilling. Brings us to the next connection that I would like to discuss. When the whole of government is hell-bent on attacking and stopping private sector innovation and investment in industries like natural gas and pipelines, and then at the same time, the whole of government is obsessed about subsidizing and protecting and mandating inefficient alternatives in the form of wind or solar or electric vehicles, things begin to get outlandish on a global scale. So as the United States government is killing off and shelving domestic pipeline projects that would improve our ability to utilize domestic energy, guess what the rest of the world is doing? They're expanding their infrastructure for these types of industries and products and technologies, and they're doing so at a record pace. Last summer, China announced a $2 trillion capital expenditure program to do what? To grow its natural gas infrastructure system over the next 3 years. The United States government takes decades to get around doing things, if ever. China gets it done in 3 years. If the whole of government is shutting down domestic natural gas infrastructure investment in the United States, and it's mandating alternatives that necessarily must come from places like China, and then at the same time, you see China committing trillions of dollars into growing its natural gas infrastructure in 3 short years, what do you suppose the capital markets are going to do? The answer is that it's going to follow the money, which is why banks and private equity and index funds and startup investors that once backed the domestic energy projects within the United States, they are now investing as much money as they can into places like China. That's right, our government is catalyzing our investors in capital markets to feed the adversary and to starve the domestic. Yet while Western governments are engaging in the self-induced crippling of their own economies and geopolitical standing, the bureaucrat in the West is doing quite well. That's true in the United States and especially true in Europe. In the Eurozone, the government spending is now more than half of the region's economic output. Yes, in Europe, the state is a bigger economic player than the private sector, and that's never a good thing for the individual or the taxpayer or the consumer or for quality of life. In France, government expenditures are almost 60% of GDP, and Italy isn't far behind. Even Germany, which used to be fiscally conservative, it's now seeing federal government expenditures at 50% of GDP. And these are post-COVID shutdowns, so they are well after the orgy of spending that Western governments engaged upon during pandemic. Government spending levels have reset at a lower level than during pandemic, but they are significantly higher than where government spending levels were as a percent of the total economy before pandemic, which of course was by design. You grab a hold of a crisis, you use it opportunistically to expand power and budget, and then when the crisis passes, you reset at an equilibrium level higher than where you were prior to the crisis. That's government and state intervention 101. Now, the United States is only and I use that term only on a relative basis, around 35% of GDP when it comes to general government expenditures. But the shape and the trend of our government presence in the economy, it's mirroring that of Europe. And without a policy course correction from Washington, rest assured the U.S. government percentage of GDP is going to continue to creep up and approach that of the Eurozone. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be like Europe. If I wanted that, I would move to Europe. It's a great place to visit for a week or two, but not a good place compared to the United States when it comes to achieving and choice and innovation and value creation. Time to close down episode 90. I want to end on an inspiring note. A few days after the first airing of episode 90, February 11th to be exact, that marks the day that Nelson Mandela walked out of prison after 27 years of incarceration. Now, incarceration in South Africa is a little bit different than that in the United States. Mandela spent 18 of his 27 years at Robben Island, just outside of Cape Town. No bed, no plumbing, every day spent working in a rock quarry, allowed to write a letter and receive a letter once every 6 months. One visitor meeting for 30 minutes once a year. Now that's hard time, and yet it didn't break his spirit. When President de Klerk released him in 1990, the inspiration was unleashed and the rest became history. Let me wrap with 3 pertinent quotes from Nelson Mandela that help serve as inspiration to the far middle and I hope to you. First, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Second quote, I like friends who have independent minds because they tend to make you see problems from all angles. And then the third and last quote from Mandela, money won't create success, the freedom to make it will. Yep, words to live by and words to be motivated by. Now go get something positive done. We'll check back and catch up again in a week.